Hi folks, this is International Master John Watson, and this is Ask the Master on ICC TV. My apologies, we seem to be having the usual technical issues. I'm getting questions already. I have a million questions people sent me, which I'm really appreciative for. So there's a lot of that, even if we don't get a lot of chat questions. And or, I'm trying to adjust my new computer here. I'm getting an ad here. You folks may be getting an ad. Well, I guess I'll just assume that the show is going to come back on, and this is on a delay. You may run into an ad. That's what I'm running into right now. Let me ask on the, yes. Okay, so I'm just going to continue here. The main idea of the show is to provide players with a forum to ask questions about chess and the chess world. This is a new venue for the show. I have to turn my sound off. Let me turn my sound off here. There we go. Let me see. This is a new venue for the show on the YouTube ICC channel, which is part of the issue we've had here. If you want to participate in the chat, which is on the right of your screen, you know, I made a little message there already. I see some of you are already participating. You will need to be logged into YouTube, which is already automatic for most of you. If you have a Gmail account, for example, or if you've synced your Google information across computers. Otherwise, it's easy to set up a username and a password. Just follow the links that YouTube provides. If you want to ask questions in advance during the week, up to say just a few hours before the show, and I've gotten a lot just at the last minute, there are now 3 good ways. First, I have a new email address. That's askimwatson, one word, @chessclub.com. We still have the Twitter channel, which is #AskIamWatson, one word. Anytime you feel like it, you can send a tweet to #AskIamWatson with a question for the show. And finally, you can message me to my ICC handle. That's pretty simple. John L. Watson, JOHNLWATSON, which is another way to reach me. The alternative is to ask a question live right now during the show, which you can do on this page at the right. You can ask about anything related to chess. A few areas that I have expertise in are chess openings. I've written a lot of books about those, and chess strategy, also leading players, chess books, videos, or any general question. I've gotten some very general questions, and that's a lot of fun, actually, about players and what happens to your chess play as you get old, which is one I got this week that I'm eager to answer because I can answer it so well. So let's start with this week's questions. I'm going to go back and forth between ones in the chat box and those sent to me from Twitter. I'll answer the ones from Twitter and my email and my ICC account at a little more length because they're more complicated questions, but I'll try not to use as long as I've sometimes used in the past. Okay, right now I only have a question. Let me start with something I was sent by email. Since I'm getting behind on those, I have some from last week too. Here's one question. Can you talk about the Hecht-Reefschlaeger variation in the French, given in Dangerous Weapons? That's a book of mine called Dangerous Weapons, the French. So let me just show you what the Hecht-Reefschlaeger is. It's a really fun opening. You might want to use it if you play the French because it gets you out of theory really quickly. And most people don't even know this move at all. It was played famously by Petrosian against Fischer, but he kind of played one of the worst possible lines, and it got a bad reputation. But it's been analyzed a lot. The site Chess Publishing, Neil MacDonald and I both over the years have put an awful lot of analysis into the Hecht-Reefschlaeger. It's also in my book, Dangerous Weapons, the French. So if you can have a subscription on that site, you can also subscribe to just one channel, such as the French, for example. You'll see in the archives, the archives are absolutely enormous, tens of thousands of games over the last, I don't know how many years, 12 years or so, by top grandmasters. It's a monthly publication with many columns on every opening. So anyway, the Hecht-Reefschlaeger is this move. It blocks off the c pawn, so it looks kind of odd. But it does threaten to take this pawn and then threaten the d pawn. And it also threatens this move e5, freeing the center, freeing the bishop to get out. So usually white plays this move Now there are other moves. There's, for example, e5. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. We have a lot of questions to get to. And then black can attack the center with f6, or some of the more sane players simply develop a knight and put it on a good square either here or here, and have done reasonably well with that. The main line by far is this, and black's idea is this. He attacks the center here, and white can play bishop d3. It's a very important move, and I think black's best answer is to go try to take that bishop or chase that bishop. He has other moves, but that's probably the easiest. The main thing you'll see, and white will also play this, but it turns out just unpinning that is just fine. Or even taking first isn't that bad. I like to unpin. The main line, of course, is simply to attack the knight. Now, in a lot of Frenches, that knight goes back here, but in the Hecht-Reefschlaeger, it comes up here with the idea of playing bishop b4. And this knight turns out to be very useful, because once you double pawns here, which you often do, that knight can go to c4. But also, it's just a quick development, and it lets you get castle queenside early. And let me just show you that. Now, there's a bunch of moves here, but the main one by far, notice you can't really take that because that d pawn will be hanging. In other words, after a move like this, you have another advantage of having the knight on c6. So often what white will do is attack that knight, try to take it twice. Black will pin, and white will unpin. There really isn't a better move. And then there are several ways to play this position, but one is simply to get the bishop pair, even though that bishop looks bad right now. Typically with the bishop pair, you can take your time to get out the second bishop. And you may even just give up the bishop pair, but you start out by taking that bishop, and then you attack in the center, for example, with this move. And now, for example, if white plays here, there are two moves. You can retreat and keep your bishop pair, or you can try to gain time by taking that, opening the f-file, and now you even have the move rook takes f3 sometimes, followed by d4, and knight takes e5 with a huge attack. Rook takes f3 is a standard black sacrifice. So that is a mega fast overview, but since a lot of people won't want to play the Hecht-Reefschlaeger, I don't want to go into much more detail, but it's a lot of fun. I played it myself fairly recently. I got a good game. For example, one problem with it is this exchange. I'll do one more little thing. There are so many things to talk about, but one slight problem with this is that white can play the exchange variation. And it turns out, and then you can play bishop b4 or bishop b5. It turns out this is relatively harmless, and I had this game recently. And typical of a lot of symmetrical positions, you can break symmetry at some point. Also, white can break symmetry at some point. There's some very nice gambits if white gets too ambitious. For example, if he plays there, you just ignore the attack. And then if he plays, just for example, this kind of move, then you have things like bishop a6 with stopping the king from castling. You might play rook b8 first. I'm not quite sure if you can even afford to maybe even play bishop a6 right away, amazingly enough, because you've got knight e4 attacks too coming up after rook e8. But rook b8 is fine. You're pawn down, but you have great position. White won't usually play that, but you never know. So that's the Hecht-Reefschlaeger. That's enough of that. All right, let's get to another question. We have something about the 5 best games ever played, but that's the sort of thing I have to prepare an answer to. Obviously, I'd have to show you the games, and I can't just answer that spontaneously. I think we mentioned this before a little bit. For example, a top game that you could play, like the Kasparov-Topalov famous game, considered the best game of all time by some people. Wonderful things, but I can't even consider. I'd have to think about this. There's so many absolutely fantastic games. All right, so let me just keep going with all these questions I got by Twitter. Here's a question. Can you describe the main ideas of the Jobava attack? Now, Badur Jobava, I don't know how to pronounce it for sure, is one of the top players of the world. He's in the top 20 in the world, an extremely strong player. And he plays all kinds of crazy openings. He's particularly well known for playing b3. I think the only thing I've heard called the Jobava attack, and there's so many irregular openings that he plays that could be called that, is also called the Jobava-Prie Attack. And it goes something like this. Now, the order is flexible, but basically, instead of playing a Veresov like this, you play this move. And you can get this position via the London also. In fact, it happens fairly often by that order. It's a pretty new opening, at least in terms of top-level play. And let me just think about how to approach this. Eric Prie has written, again, for the site Chess Publishing, a wonderful site. He's written a lot of work, and that's why it's sometimes called the Jobava-Prie attack. It's like a berry attack. A berry attack could still happen in this position if black played, for example, here and white played here. That's called the berry attack against the King's Indian. And I have some ideas against that. Actually, I wonder if that's worth talking about. Maybe not, but I think a very simple system against the berry attack is to go like this, and then take that knight off, and then play like this, and then you play for e5 by castling and playing like that. So it's a very easy system, and I think we put that in our book, Taming the Wild Chess Openings. I know it's been in other writing that I've done. That's the berry, but in the Jobava-Prie, you tend to avoid the knight f3 move for a while, and so you get unique positions. So I looked at a bunch of games in this opening, a lot by Jobava, and an article by Kuzmin in the New in Chess Yearbook, number 112. It was played by Nakamura in Rapid Play, and it was played by Richard Rapport, another 2700 plus player who has very eccentric tastes and plays a lot of crazy openings. So the question was, what about the ideas of it? And I think that's almost a funny question, because the ideas change according to whatever black does. And I'm not quite sure what the idea is besides get your pieces out quickly and maybe castle queenside. Two ideas that I think are relevant are knight b5. Not so much that someone's going to fall for taking on c7, but it might tie down black. Black has to watch out for it. He might have to play knight a6 as an answer, and that's not a very good place for your knight. So knight b5 is an idea. Maybe that would be better explained by looking at a bunch of examples, but it's kind of a threat right now. And therefore, sometimes black plays c6, but the problem with that is that then he can't play c5 to attack the center. Or he might play a6, but that's an extra pawn move in the opening. And in fact, a6 has been played quite a bit. I did want to say, okay, so that's one idea. And then the other idea, another idea that comes up pretty often is this. Just playing for taking over the center, because you already have a little lead in development, so you can afford to make some pawn moves. Now, if black plays this move, which I think is pretty strong, it's one of the two main moves, then you might play this anyway, kind of bluffing playing here, which might turn into sort of a Blackmar-Diemer Gambit that we looked at last week, or playing for this move. And this has actually occurred in some of Jobava's games and other people's games, trying to trap the bishop, but also maybe just advance on this side of the board and gain space. You know, it's a huge thing in chess by strong players, is simply gaining space is in and of itself an advantage. So that's one idea against bishop f5, for example. And the main move, probably the one that's the most critical move, and that I would be very tempted to play myself, is this, because it counterattacks immediately. And then there's a few interesting ideas. See, this is the thing about saying what are the ideas, because they vary every time. Notice that this time knight b5 doesn't work, threatening here, because just queen a5 check hits the knight and forces him to come back again. So what white usually does, I think the smart whites play e3, and I think Jobava has almost always played this. The other interesting move, though, is to play e4, kind of a wacko move. And we saw something like this before. It's a reverse Albin Gambit. And in fact, if black plays here and white plays here, this can also come up from the London system. It's a position that also can come up from the London system. And if you know the Albin Gambit, we talked about this already, white has an extra move over the normal black side of an Albin Gambit. I think black's okay here, but it's fun. It's fun to play. White has good attacking chances. Some of the ideas are f3, bishop b5 check is useful sometimes, and just castling queenside and then attacking is the other idea. Unfortunately, in this exact position, I've got a feeling this is a better way to play. And white has played this way before, and I feel like black should be just fine here. For one thing, white's queenside has been abandoned, so I'd be tempted to just go here and gain a tempo attacking the queenside. Got a feeling this one isn't quite as good as the other Albin reversed, but you can play it, and it may have even been played. Yeah, it has been played, but maybe not with g6, I'm not sure. So what is that? That's the Jobava. So here's the Jobava, is this Jobava-Prie attack, is this position. And it's just beginning to be investigated, and it's a lot of fun. You can try it yourself. I think it beats the Verisov attack in some ways because it's more interesting, but which would be bishop g5 instead. It would start with knight c3, and then white would play this bishop g5 move. All right, so I was also asked actually this week, might as well get rid of this one too, that if you play this pseudo-Trompowsky that we talked about last week, well, actually, I'm sorry, no, if you play a Trompowsky, which is this move, someone asked that after d5, what do you do if you aren't going to take this? Some people don't want to take this because it gives up the bishops voluntarily while losing a tempo without being forced to. And then black can get active play, either try and get a big center or play this way and try to get the pieces out quickly. And that's fine. That's one of the main lines, as white has a lot of advantages, so does black. It's an interesting position. What this person wants to know is what can you play instead of taking on f6? And there's a couple of answers to that. One is e3, which is what I've played in these positions. And if black plays knight e4, then you just go back again. It's very similar to the main lines of the Trompowsky. And your idea is just to develop. You might even put the bishop out before the knight. That can be kind of handy sometimes, working against knight e4. Maybe I should give you an example of that. Can't even think of an example. That's not a good thing. Okay, well, for example, maybe here, here, and if black just develops somehow, let's just make a random move here. And the idea is a lot of times you're threatening now to take this, actually, even though it gives up the bishops, because that pawn, it's a good pawn structure. That pawn can be attacked, and then, if need be, the pawn can be, the structure can be broken up, and white gets good attacking chances. So that's one reason you might play e3. Some people prefer to play knight d2, which simply stops knight here. And often you'll get some sort of Torre attack out of this. The Torre attack goes something like, well, it depends what black does, but for example, this kind of setup, knight bd7 is an interesting option that people don't play very much, and I think they should. And that'll relate to a later question we have about the Semi-Slav, actually. But anyway, this is the Torre attack. You can also put the bishop there. White sets his pieces like this. And obviously both sides have options, but white usually is headed for this, so he won't have that many options, or he's not going to be considering many options because this is his goal. And white's ideas often are to try and play knight e5 and get an attack on the king side, f4 if possible, and then swing things over to the king side. You can see a lot of things are sort of aimed that way. So that's a fascinating line. And so really knight d2 is an attempt to try to get into the Torre attack. I'm afraid the way we have our camera now, I'm actually faced away from you, but that's the way things go. Interesting, all sorts of interesting stuff going on here. So that's why you would play knight d2, is to stop knight e4 and set up a Torre attack. So those are the two main answers besides bishop takes knight. So that's an answer to that question. The Bongcloud, okay, I have a question. I might as well answer this. It's a crazy question. This is not advanced Grandmaster chess, but the question is why the Bongcloud is not accepted as an opening, but the creepy Crawley is accepted as an opening. And the Bongcloud apparently is this move, and I think the reason it's not accepted as an opening is because it does no good whatsoever. I guess what you're hoping to do is get checkmated. Right, you're hoping that something like this happens, and that checkmate. So white is hoping to commit suicide, I guess. Anyway, there's no point to queen e2. The creepy Crawley, the moves are actually useful. It goes, well, one of them is at least, which is this. This is a useful move against almost any opening black makes. Now, after this, white has a whole variety of interesting moves. After a3, a3 is the first move. One of them is here. One of them is transposing to a Polish opening. c4 is like an English opening kind of position, and you've kind of lured him into playing e5, which you might like, because you're a tempo ahead of the Sicilian. It's like, Kelly Sicilian. It might turn into a Najdorf structure. And you have other moves. You can even play here with all kinds of weird, fancy ideas, like playing a reversed Ruy Lopez, but having stopped that move. It's kind of crazy. And if the bishop goes here instead of bishop b4, you can sometimes play for sacrifices on e5 and forks and things like that. For example, knight here with the idea of d4, and if he plays here, then you can go here. This is the same as a reverse black position, but the main move now for white in a reverse position is here, and you've stopped it with your extra move a3. Wonderful stuff by playing one a3. And you can play all kinds of things. Unfortunately, the question is about the creepy Crawley, which we put in our book, Taming the Wild Chess Openings, which is that move. Because you're going to creepily Crawley move up the board, I guess. And that move is relatively useless. I guess it stops pins on g4 and knights coming to g4. Maybe it supports this move, and you can play a kind of a Grobe kind of position. In other words, you might even want to play, maybe not immediately, but you might want to play this pretty soon to get bishop here in. And I'm not quite sure how that's helping you, but it probably is a little bit. So that's the creepy Crawley. At least these are moves that don't hurt your position much and still give you chances to play good things. A3 for sure is legitimate. A3 followed by H3 is, I don't think it is really accepted. Okay, then I have a question. Can you recommend a good anti-King's Indian as white, not too much theory? Very broad question. We covered something it might be considered too much theory back then. I'll name a couple of systems. One we covered last week, which is actually pretty interesting. But already you're getting into, playing big main opening moves like this, so you may not want to even get that far. But if you are willing to get that far, I think this one's very interesting to play there followed by that. And you can check last week's lecture on this. That's one interesting sideline. Another interesting kind of sideline is to play this kind of move. And the timing on that move is funny. I kind of like the Smyslov system. I used to recommend this to students and I played it really occasionally, which is to play this move now. Usually in the Smyslov system, you don't commit with E4, which after all weakens the D4 square. It weakens that square on D4. My circles and arrows are coming up very slowly here suddenly. And let me, I'm going to quit this program because for some reason my board is responding slowly. So black plays here, for example, and then white plays this move. And the idea is just to bring your pieces out with knight here. The bishop can knight to f3. The bishop can go to e2, for example, and or d3 in some cases. So we get something like this, and this maybe. And black can try and attack back either way with this move followed by e5, with knight bd7 followed by e5. My arrows are very slow here. Or usually they throw in the move h6. And sometimes they try to track down this. Let's just look at a typical variation. I'm going to put the bishop on d3 for reasons you'll see in just a second. Let's say he tries to track down the bishop and get rid of it, and white plays. This is a handy move in the Smyslov, these two moves together. I'm not saying these are good moves. I just want to show you these moves. And then here. And one thing that's happened here is white has at least gained this square, and he can play g4 to put more control on that square. If you could get a knight there, it would be particularly good, which could go to either one of these squares, these outpost squares. That doesn't mean white's better. I'm just trying to show you some of the themes. The other way that more top players like, and I've played as black, has been to play for c5. So you play something like this, and maybe even c5 right now. Brings the queen out to make pressure. Whenever a bishop is away from the queen side, like that, you want to think in terms of attacking on the queen side with moves like queen b6 or queen a5. And use this bishop, which is aiming towards the queen side too. So that's, and also maybe bishop f5. That's a move people like to make, by the way, bishop f5. For example, if white just develops here, they like to make that move and maybe play knight e4 to kind of free this bishop, exchange some pieces, and really get equality. So that's the Smyslov system. I shouldn't have said that much about it maybe, but that's a very good irregular line, I think. Now, if you want to get really basic, really fundamental, you can play the London system against the King's Indian. You can just play this kind of thing. I've done this before. A lot of players are playing this now. Kamsky's famous for it, but a lot of other top players are suddenly playing it. Just play this line. You can look it up, but the idea is it's hard to get that move in, and white develops very quickly and has a whole variety of plans. Against the King's Indian, it's nice to play c4 instead of the London, the move they often make in the London, which is c3. The famous way for white to get a good game, and the order of this is, sorry, I tried to castle. The order is funny. You don't usually actually play h3 that early, but I'm going to do it anyway for illustrative purposes. If black plays his normal King's Indian plan, which is, for example, this followed by e5, a lot of times what white will do is he'll get the move c5 in. So I'm not necessarily giving you the right move order, but basically something like this. And if black plays slowly, sometimes that will be a good move, just breaking up this structure. And you don't lose material if you do it right. Actually, black's usually played it, my fault. Black's, in order to make progress, black usually plays this as in a King's Indian attack. And then white has this idea. Or rook c1 first. Okay, this is London systems. So that's 3 systems you can try. There's a lot of irregular systems. You can play a Torre attack right away. But in the King's Indian proper, when c4 is already in, let me think if I can think of anything else that's interesting. They're all pretty good because the King's Indian defense is, after all, pretty slow. So white has plenty of options for playing slow lines. What else do I like for white that I think is interesting? Let's say you make Well, okay, this one's a little weird, but sometimes you can play things like this and then knight c3 at some point. For example, g3 lines. My fault, my fault. I've done this wrong. Let's play g3 first. This is the line I was thinking of. Something like this, where you play for e4, and then you put one knight here and you put the other knight here. That can give Martinovsky system, it's called sometimes. And pretty good players have played this. It's a way of not exposing yourself with c4 and not getting developed more quickly. And it's very hard for black to counterattack. So that's kind of fun. So there's 4 answers. There are a lot more. What else do we have here? We have just a series of moves that are given. And I'm not sure what the question. Oh, and now you say black, it's easy to play with bishop d6, but how about the computer recommendation bishop g5? Interesting. Okay, I don't know which book. A series on the Chigorin. You consider the following position. Now that's very interesting. The series on the Chigorin in Inside Chess is at least 20 years ago, so we've got an older player here. Oh, no, I did the Chigorin ICC, excuse me. He's talking about the ICC lecture. Okay. So, yeah, sorry about that. Forgot. I've done so much stuff on ICC, and that'll be in the archives, the recommending playing the Chigorin. Okay, so I apparently give these moves. Do I have a memory? No. So I don't remember exactly what happens here. Notice knight b4 can be met with rook c1. It's fairly useless, or at least not very good. Now the computer recommends, I'm sorry, knight f3 first, I assume, for white. Yeah. Okay, apparently I give this move, which looks awfully nice to me. Just oppose the bishops, get developed, get ready to castle. But he's saying the computer talks about this move. Interesting. Am I going to make up something quickly and make a fool of myself, or am I going to take this home and answer it next time? I'm not sure. Let me think about it. Now that threatens this, and there's also a queen b3 idea. So, although maybe not immediately. If you castle, you're losing the d pawn, but I'm not sure necessarily how bad that is. This is an interesting position. I guess if worse comes to worse, you can think about playing here. But you still might have to worry about that pawn and that pawn. This gets messy. This gets really messy. Very interesting. It might just be a good move for white. This is very interesting. Great question. I'm very tempted to sacrifice that in order to get the 2 bishops. But how exactly to make that work, I'm not sure. Because there might be a bishop b5 check idea, b4 check idea also, if you time it right. I guess the move bishop b4 is conceivable too. One reason for that move would be that white's moved his bishop twice. Maybe you can move your bishop twice. And that releases the pressure on that square. And it even cuts off the queen from attacking b7. It means white has to work harder to attack b7. So bishop b4 is it looks like a safe answer. So I wish I could give more. I'd have to really look at this position. I'd like to turn the engine on too and just make sure I'm not making silly comments. I hope that does something that's useful. I'd rather give you a more thorough answer, but I think you could get away at least with bishop b4. Interesting. Okay, so how long was your longest game? Well, in the old days, we had these infinite time controls where we would play 40 moves in, believe it or not, 2.5 hours. This is the normal time control, and then 20 moves in an hour after that. And I remember one time I went into the 6th time control. I was almost at 120. But I talk to people now with these increments. They play out these drawn endings, and people. Somebody in the last tournament I played in had 160 moves, and another game with over 110. But that's a little different because really people are just wasting time there because of the increment situation. So in a way, those aren't serious games. Even if somebody wins them, they aren't that serious. But that's the longest I ever had. I will try to find that lecture from last week. What do you recommend against the Trompowsky? That's an awfully general question. I can show you some systems against it. What I wouldn't recommend doing is, if you don't know much about it, is I wouldn't recommend playing these main lines because you really need to know what you're doing. White can get big attacks because he's going to get a big center, and there's a lot of lines like this where black plays here attacking this. Sometimes you can sacrifice that pawn. You have to know this. I guess that's the point I want to make as black. So it's a lot easier to play something simple like either e6 or d5. I've played e6. And I also play white. I play the Trompowsky with white, and I like e6. Now that allows e4. So you have to know what to do against that. There are two ways to play against that. One is that, now notice the bishop, if it retreats, you just play g5 and you win a center pawn. That's not good. So the bishop has to take. One is you get the two bishops and you get behind in space. You play moves like d6, b6, g5, which at least gains a tempo and has the idea of playing bishop g7, knight d7, working against e5. White, of course, will try to play e5 at some point. White's ahead in development, and the queen is exposed. That's his advantage. Black's advantage is two bishops in a compact position without any weaknesses yet. So that's a line. You can also, after bishop there, make some kind of funny-looking moves like this. It's an interesting move to play. I'm sorry, not h6, excuse me. Or maybe h6, no, c5 is an interesting move. I've always kind of thought that was worth at least thinking about. But I would say that the main line with e6 is to play h6 and then retake with a queen here. Now, there's plenty of other moves. We just talked about this move d5 and whether white should take that now or just bring out a knight or play pawn here. A lot of top grandmasters use this move. Why not? You get your pieces out quickly. You establish yourself in the center. You stop e4. So that's a good line. There are tricky lines like c6 that people play in order to get the queen out quickly. In fact, I suppose if he plays there, you can win a 4-move game. Check and then take this. I think I pointed out last week, it's easy to miss things like that. What else can you do here? Well, there's all kinds of things. This is not a bad move because this is not clear that capture helps white very much. That's black can set up with d6 and c5 and f5 and bishop g7. Of course, white doesn't have to take it. White can play a Torre-like position, as we mentioned before. You know, the e3 and knight here and bishop here. And there are other things white can do. So obviously, this is a very complicated question. Anytime you ask what can you do against the second move of the game, you're going to get a lot of answers. This move looks natural, but it's probably going to transpose into one of these lines with knight e4 if white plays here, for example. Okay, so that's just the beginning thing. One thing to say is that after that move, you can play almost anything because it's not that threatening a move. This is not a big threat because it gives up two bishops, doesn't it? Oh, which means this is also a move, although I don't like that one because it's a little bit weak. So that's sort of an answer to that question. I hope it's decent. And will you ever write a 5th edition to play the French? I hope not. It's too much work. I spent ages on this last one. Every time I write a new edition, I don't just update the old lines. In fact, I tend to substitute new lines and start brand new ones. So it always takes forever. I'm very, very picky with my French books, which means I'm sort of proud of them. Those are good books, I think. Somebody says here, I even know a 292-move game. I think, what's the site? Tim Krabbe, Krabbe, has a site with all the chess records, like the longest game without exchanging a piece. There are so many of these records. The first rook move, or the earliest rook move, the latest one, the shortest game, almost anything you can think of. It's a wonderful site. He's the guy who wrote the script for The Vanishing, which is the original Vanishing, which is a brilliant Dutch movie that's very famous among film buffs. A really very interesting person, Tim Krabbe. Krabbe with an accent on the E, I think. Okay, so I can go back now to the I don't see any more questions right here, but that's okay because I have a lot of questions that people sent me. Remember, you can send me to my email account at askimwatson at chessclub.com, or hashtag askimwatson, that's a Twitter account, or just message me on ICC at John L. Watson, one word, John Lwatson. All right, so here we go. Here's a pretty good question. The main lines of the Semi-Slav, let me show you that. Well, he gives it as c6. Let me just show you first. Let's just make these moves. The Semi-Slav is this, and then he's asking about this line. Now, white can play very sharply with this, but that's a whole different question. He's asking about the e3 line and here. That's basically the Semi-Slav line that he's talking about. And the main lines are bishop d3 and queen c2. But before we get to that, I think I'll repeat what I said last week, which is if you play it with a c6 move order, you have new things to think about. The exchange variation is more symmetrical, and a lot of people don't want to play against that. For example, this kind of position. People aren't always thrilled to play this line, for example. So what people do, if they get to the Semi-Slav, but they do it by going to what's called the triangle system, they play here first, which is a Queen's Gambit decline, and then they play here. And then very often white will simply play into the position we just saw, which is this. Okay, now let's talk about that position. He says, well, the main lines were terrifying to white a while ago. I haven't kept up on the theory, so how is this opening faring nowadays? Has white even found a tiny bit of an edge, or is it just a hard game with mutual chances? Now, by the main line, he means there are two things. This is the traditional Moran variation, which has theory that goes on to move 30 sometimes. And as far as I know, it's doing very well for black. This is the main line, and white tends to play this move, bishop d3. And black can play either a6 or bishop b7, as we talked about before. The idea of a6, which Anand played in the World Championship against Kramnik, is to play c5 and bishop b7 and attack the center and get a beautiful long diagonal. And maybe even put the bishop here and get an attack on the king, since the king's probably going to castle king side. The idea of bishop b7 is to gain a tempo, don't waste a6, and play b4 followed by c5. Without having used an extra move on a6. White is often expanding in the center in the meantime with moves like that. You can look up the theory. Now, what I find is it's not being played as much anymore at all. White is avoiding this line quite a bit. And even queen c2, which is the most popular alternative that this questioner asks about, is also not played quite as much. And the main line there probably goes like this. Now, you can't take that. A lot of people do that, even though the bishop gets to c4 with one move. And then white can play, for example, this, which is a little more popular now than bishop e2. But I don't think anybody thinks that white gets an advantage out of this position anymore. What am I doing wrong? E5, basically. So it goes here, here, e5. There's also one where you simply play e5. Is it right now? Yeah, I guess it's right now, isn't it? This is also played. Wow, what a memory, folks. Yeah, in fact, white sometimes wins a pawn here with, I think, this move. Although now you have this, don't you? Yeah, it's something like that. No, that one's hanging. So he plays a6. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little confused, but there are various ways to meet this. Traditionally, you would take and then play here. Oh, here we go. I know what it is. It's taking first in e4, I think. If you castle, okay, here we go. Now I got it. Black plays e5. That's his freeing move. And the main idea for white that gives him dynamic ideas is this, with a lot of tension in the center. But this seems to come down to equality. I think Giri and Vashir Lagrave have recently played some games with this, and they've been drawn. It looks like black just doesn't get enough out of this. Oh, white just doesn't get enough out of this, and it's just kind of dead equal. So now what's going on, you see a lot of times you'll see different orders here. Let me show you, for example. Now, by the way, with this order, there's this traditional gambit, which is not bad, the Marshall gambit. Don't see it that much at the top levels. But a lot of times white will be playing e3 moves. Let me show you another way that white likes to play this sometimes. White likes to play with knight f3. And then when black gets into this basic sort of position here, he'll put the knight on d2. The idea being to play here and here again, but not have to worry about captures followed by b4, b5, b4 attacking this knight. I give this in my repertoire series on ICC as a possibility for white to play, if you go back and look at the archives. Another thing that white's doing is playing funny moves like, I'll just get to the main position, playing funny moves like g3. Kramnik played this recently, and it's been played a lot, actually, over the years, but especially over the last couple of years. And it involves a gambit, usually, where black actually hangs on to this pawn at some point. Or black can just leave the pawn sitting there and play knight d7 and things like that. I love this position for white. I think it's enjoyable for both sides, but I like playing this way. And it's just gotten popular recently. Another way to avoid the Moran, let me think. Another way to avoid the Moran is to play right into this, but then after you play something like this here, you go to a safer square here. You give up on the idea of e4 for the moment. It turns out this is interesting. Karpov used to play this. And one of the ideas is to play this move a3 to discourage b4. So you can look into that. There's other slow ways to play that don't threaten black's equality, but give white a sort of interesting game. And you'll find that these main lines aren't being played as much anymore for white, at least recently. They're still played, but just not as much. Okay, so that was an answer to that. There's probably more to say about that. When players start to age, what chess skills tend to go first? And I think I'm an expert on this one because I'm experiencing this in disturbing fashion. My own ability to calculate quickly has really fallen apart. And I think that's the main thing, calculation and speed of calculation. And I'm not calculating that badly, but it's taking me too long. And especially in time trouble, I'm a hopeless mess. So not that I was ever that great at it, but I was able to make moves quickly, and now my brain tends to freeze up, and that's, I think, typical old person's problem, is that your brain just doesn't act as well or as fast. So that's my issue. Now other people complain of fatigue, and I've gotten some of that, and basically you don't have as consistent an alertness, so that can lead to blunders, because if you aren't alert and you're a little tired, you can actually just miss things that are hanging. So I think also fatigue can lead to a general lack of excitement and incentive and imagination, although I find myself playing absolutely imaginatively recently. So I'm coming up with a lot of fresh ideas over the board, but maybe they're just a little too exciting, and they take a little too long to implement. Okay, so that's another question. Let's see what else we have on the chat channel. Oh, we've got a bunch of stuff here. Well, we just talked about the Grobe and the Borg last week, but I'll show it to you again. There's a question, is the Grobe, especially with black, playable? Okay, well, I'll repeat what I said last week, which is that this is the Grobe, which is to play with this move. Basman, of course, is the famous one who played this all the time. I think it's a terrible opening, really, if black plays well. Obviously, the answer is just to take over the center, but there's some very specific things that we have in our Taming the Wild Chess Openings book. I also have it in Mastering the Chess Openings. But the Borg is, you're losing yet another tempo. I didn't even remember what it was. Oops, E4, G5. And it's the same thing, except even worse, because white has actually got both center pawn moves in and threatens bishop G5. And what does it say? Is it playable? Was that the question? And I would say no. It's just too slow. He says, how about play bishop D6 instead of F3 instead of knight F6? Okay, he's referring to the Slav issue. And maybe I should expand on that. Well, one thing is you can just take this in this position. Now, it used to be that there'd be issues with that because that's pinned, but in this exact position, you'll never get this pawn back without giving up enormous concessions. So that doesn't really work. So really you have to play here, and that's so slow. There's always H4, attacking that again. G4 is we looked at this last week, is a gambit that might have some point at least, even though white's quite a bit better in this position. Actually, he's almost winning, but at least black gets some play, or white can just develop here, and black's position is sort of shattered, and white has the center. That's the idea. I don't think I'll spend any more time on it. You can go back to last week and look at that as well. We have a follow-up question about the Slav, whether black can play for F5. And the way that goes is that's if white plays knight C3 first, and then plays, for example, something like this. Then you get this idea of playing F5, and that's been played a lot. I don't like it for black. Now, there's other ways to get F5 in, and he may be referring to those. But this particular order, I think that's a nice answer. And you have to know a lot and study a lot, but this is in my Mastering the Chess Openings book, volume 2, for example. And I think that's very dangerous. I think the F5 that would work better, and it's probably the one he's talking about, would be something with this order. Let me see if I can get this right. Let's say white plays there with the idea of going here, for example. Oh, what am I doing? Knight F6 can't be that, can it? C6, let's say. And if white plays like that, maybe now you can play F5, and it's better because there's no G4. And also because the knight can't kind of come around to this knight square. That's probably the one that the listener is asking about. Absolutely respectable system for black. I still like white in these positions, but I have to admit not as much as in the other positions. And it takes a sophisticated player as white here to figure out exactly what to do, how to maneuver this knight properly, how to take advantage of that sort of hole. So yeah, it's definitely respectable to play this way as black. But as I say, there are more problems if you play it against the knight c3 order, it turns out. It turns out that this kind of position is not that friendly. Even the main lines here aren't as good because white has extra options of bringing knights to that really nice f4 square, for example. And there's other reasons it's not quite as good. This knight is a little awkward here. If you put it there really early, it eliminates some of your possibilities. Okay, so what else do we have here? We have bishop d6 instead of an early f5. Excuse me, sorry. I'm getting, I didn't look over there. Things are changing rapidly. So maybe bishop d6 first. You're kind of asking for an e4 line here because you can't play bishop b4. So maybe this setup would, well, let's put this here first. I see, and then f5. Might transpose, because in most stone walls you're going to play bishop, modern stone walls, you play bishop d6 anyway and knight f6. So it might transpose into the kind of position we were just talking about. I don't know if there's any disadvantages to putting bishop d6 in that early. There might be some issue where you'd rather take back with this pawn, but you can't because of knight b5. This would be later on. Anything else I can think of? No, it looks like this is probably a pretty playable thing. Maybe knight e5 is a little better because you don't want to give up this bishop. So maybe an early f4. I know that looks strange, like it wastes time, but I think this position's been played before. I doubt if that's a serious disadvantage. So the answer to the question is, yeah, it looks okay to play bishop d6 first. I can't remember if there's any real problems with it. As long as you play f5 soon, because you can't really allow e4. Okay, good question. What else do we have here? Okay, maybe back to some Twitter questions. I didn't check the beginning time on this because we were late. So I think we have about 25 more minutes or something like that. Maybe someone could tell me. Give me a chat and tell me how long we've been on so far, because I don't want to go over. But we still have a considerable amount of time, I think. Now, let me... So we'll go for about another 20 minutes or so. Now, here's a whole bunch of questions. Let me see which ones are the easiest to talk about. I also want to get different people. Some people sent multiple questions. I love it when you send me questions, by the way, and they've all been really good. Here's one. What do you recommend against b3? I've gotten that for 2 straight weeks from the same person, Captain K, so I better answer it. I keep saying, well, next week I'll answer that. Unfortunately, again, there's so many things you can play. You can play almost anything against b3 and equalize if you know what you're doing. Jobava, as I say, has played a lot of b3s. Sometimes people like to avoid e5, so they play this first, which is called the Nimzo-Larsen attack, and then whatever black does, let's say this or something, white plays b3 now because there's no e5 move. So I just thought I'd mention that. The direct b3 was also played by Larsen, but he liked to play knight f3 also. And that means that you could play here for one thing, and then just defend it. So one of the main lines here, popular line for black, is to play this way, and then when white plays here, threatening to take followed by takes, instead of getting a little passive with this move, which by the way also equalizes if you know what you're doing, you play actively, well, sort of actively. You develop quickly. You play there. Now, one thing is that looks really stupid blocking the d pawn, but if white ever takes this, which is why else is that bishop out there, then it's not blocked anymore, is it? The d pawn isn't blocked. So it makes sense that way. The main reason it makes sense is because now you can castle, getting a nice lead in development. Maybe then play rook e8. Let me just show you some moves. Let's say white plays conservatively, which I think he usually does actually, and maybe castles. One thing you can do now is play rook there, and then you might get that move in, but if you don't get that move in, you can play the bishop back and d5. A very solid system and a good way to play. There's a famous line where white plays, let me show you, this is funny, I use this as an example of modern chess. And you'll see it in a lot of books just because it's so cute, I think people can't resist talking about it. One answer to bishop d6 is to play knight here, and that's a beautiful move because it attacks the bishop, which you can't afford to give up, and attacks the pawn. So what black does is the amazing move here, going away from the center of the board, but stopping the knight from coming here. And knight a5 has some other advantages because it allows you to get c6 in with tempo, and then when your bishop moves, you're going to have d5. Anyway, crazy line. Again, I think there's a very early Jobava game where this happened, and now it's routine. I don't know if white gets a small advantage here with some clever sequence of moves, or if it's just equal. At one point, I think people thought white might be slightly better, but these things are really crazy. Isn't that a fun sequence? So very modern. But look at those moves. You move your, let's just go back. Let's review that for a second. You move your bishops out before your knights. And I still see that commented upon by Russian commenters, that that's a rule that they take seriously. So first you get your bishops out. Then you play another bishop out. Here we go. And then black blocks off his own pieces. You'd think any square would be better than d6 for the bishop. And white plays a knight to the side of the board, and black plays another knight to the side of the board. So this refutes the notion that you can't break the rules of chess, the traditional classical rules, and get a good game. I suspect this is still okay for black. I like the other line better. Okay, now what can you do besides e5? Well, plenty of things. You can play c5. And one nice structure for black is to play c5 and e5. For example, this move. Now, if white tries to stop e5, you can simply enforce it with that move. That'll be next. And if, okay, so the most natural move is this, not the only move, here. And you get this kind of position. I don't know what white plays here, maybe c4. But one thing black can do now is go like this to work against the d4 move. And then he's going to put a knight here. It's called the Botvinnik setup in castles. I like that system for black. But of course, white's equal. b3 is not a bad move at all. And you can do it. You can always just develop. You can play King's Indian, because this move is too crazy. It just doesn't do enough. You can just develop, and after g5, just go here. It turns out white's weakened himself more than he's helped himself. And this move, white's now moved his bishop 3 times just to get doubled pawn. So it's like a Trompowsky, but I think much worse for white than the Trompowsky. Black has it so easy here. He's getting his pieces out so quickly. f5s and d5s. And so this is an easy position. So white wouldn't take that, probably. White would play something else. Okay, that's a few answers to 1b3. There are others, obviously. Oh, I got to show you something, though. Once I played against a grandmaster, and I drew this move. It was inspired by the fact that I roomed with this one Yugoslavian IM who showed me this move, and of course I didn't believe it at all. It opens up the bishop, wastes a move, doesn't develop a piece, but it's actually kind of cool. It sort of blocks the position. You're still planning to play d5 and get a big center. And one of the main ideas is if white tries to break that up, which looks good, you just go here. Now if black takes it, of course, you're taking with the queen with tempo and getting all the dark squares. But if he takes this way, all of a sudden you have ideas of playing bishop b4 check. An early bishop b4 check. And of course, bishop c5 is a move, and just d5. I won't go into a lot of detail. but basically, yeah, I think my opponent played c4 first. Anyway, it's playable. It's not a wonderful system. I'm sure white, well, I don't know, sure, but I bet white gets a tiny advantage out of this. But it was fun. It was great. It got me a draw. I just wanted to do something different. Okay, so now what do we have here? We have give some advice to improve a player with 2100 for several years. Wow. Well, it depends on what you're doing wrong. I'd have to actually look at your games. Study, play. It's the usual things. You might, if you've been studying just openings or something, you might want to switch for a while and study something like the Games of the Great Players. I think games collections are always wonderful. You might pick a player who plays a little bit like you or plays similar openings. That means you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone sometimes. Playing a lot always helps. I wouldn't play too much blitz, even on ICC. I don't want to advertise against my favorite channel here, my employer. But I wouldn't play too much. I think it's useful to play blitz. If you can play slower games on ICC or play in their tournaments, like their team tournaments, 45-minute games, things like that, even 15-minute games are useful. Play in tournaments, of course, if you get a chance. A lot of players find their tactics are a problem, so they can do tactical exercises. I find that those exercises don't always work for my students, because you don't get those positions and you know there's a tactic in the position already. So one thing you can do is study your openings, but study them with an eye to characteristic tactical themes. Play some active openings, ambitious ones, and learn what the tactics are in that opening. Now that sounds very narrow, but it turns out those tactics will appear in countless other openings too. It's a fun way to learn because, again, you kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You learn more about your own openings. There are so many ways to improve, and they really depend completely on what's wrong with your play, unfortunately. 2100, as we know, listeners know, is not a bad rating at all. I really wish I could help with that. I think it's sort of obvious solutions. I just analyze the person. Sometimes you'll find you're just doing funny things like, well, playing too slowly, getting in time trouble, being too perfectionist, or the opposite. You could be playing too quickly. There are just so many things that people can do wrong, unfortunately, and that's true probably in any field. But sorry, I can't help a little more there. Maybe next time, or you could even contact me by John L. Watson, and we could look at some games maybe. That's my ICC handle. Okay, in your series on unconventional openings, you recommend meeting d4, knight c6 with d5. Okay. But didn't consider novelty recommended in the Dark Knight system. Are you aware of this book? Yeah, I've looked at the Dark Knight system, and I've actually got some good lines against some of the stuff that he says. I may not have looked at this position. I'm not sure. I think in Taming the Wild Chess Openings, I looked at that, which is a more recent book than that series. I think I looked at that book and tried to address what he said. This idea here, I think there's a knight g6 line. I think, I'm going to get this wrong. Oh, I like this move. And he does talk about that, I think. My memory's not good enough. I read just way too many books. I don't think the ending is any good, so I think he plays here. And then one thing I found was very interesting was in this position, which looks just fine for white, playing natural moves, right? That there's a crazy move here, h4, which I couldn't find a good answer to. Isn't that amazing? It's really nice idea. You're just going to gain a lot of time. You're trying to open this file. You're trying to get rid of that knight, which has been jumping all over the place. And you get too tied down. I think you even lose a piece if that happens. Check, hitting the knight twice. Knight has to come back, and maybe f5. I think works. I haven't analyzed it, but it looks just offhand. It looks like that's going to work. Oh, excuse me, maybe not. This is tough. And you have to look up what I said. Boy, a good way to mess up. Maybe this move with the idea of bishop d3 is a good idea. Sometimes it'll even be a sacrifice, I suppose. Sorry about that. Can't remember why that works, but I think h4 is a good move. Probably missing something pretty obvious. Anyway, that looks pretty good though, what I just showed. What else? Yeah, I'm sorry. It could be that I just missed it, what he said, and what he said is good. So I won't swear by what happened there. But thanks for alerting me to that, and I'll check that out. Can you play the Sicilian as white by wasting a tempo with a3 to play some kind of Sicilian? We just talked about that. That's what we just talked about, which was this move, and if this, that's one way. There's also a lot of other English openings where you get a Sicilian reverse with a3. For example, here. For example, here. White can play a3 already and play this. I talk about this extensively, this whole a3 idea, in my first volume of Mastering the Chess Openings, various a3 deviations. Also, something like this is a reverse position you can play there, which stops bishop b4, and it discourages bishop c5 because of later on playing some move like b4, or maybe even immediately, I don't know. So yeah, a3 definitely to get you a reversed position, and this one would be, you can do anything that allows d5. Let me just explain that. For example, here's a point. You could play a Paulsen reversed, or Taimanov reversed with that kind of move. That's a well-known opening as black, but you're a tempo up as white. Similarly, you can play queen c2 here. There are a whole variety of these kinds of things. Well, of course, you could play d6. You could play a kind of a Najdorf-y kind of thing, except your knight's already on c6. Let's see if I can do this. 2d3 is a thought. Try to get a Najdorf kind of position. And then you could throw in a6 and hope that he plays here. And if he plays there, you gain this tempo, and you have a Najdorf already. And you could play, for example, b4 or some other move. So, yeah, you can try and do things with a3. Black obviously won't allow that in most cases. For example, here, bishop b4 check turns out to be a pretty good move, even though it's a tempo behind the bishop b4 Moscow system. I'm sorry, it tends to be a pretty good move in this position. At least a reasonable move. I could go in a lot of detail about move orders, but that would take us quite a long time, and I want to get to other questions. Is this d4 and e5 like the Alyakin's defense? Well, of course it is, isn't it? Now, of course, a lot of people don't play that. They just play here, and then you can play two versions of the Nimzovich defense. One is this, and the other one is this. I think this one might be a little underrated, actually. White could play gambits here, for example, and get d5 in anyway, but it's not easy. I think it's an interesting defense. Maybe that's better in the long run, but at least that gets Black's bishop out in front of his pawn chain after e6. So there, and you can try for f6 in some lines, but it's worth trying. I think as Black. This one could be shaky if White knows what he's doing after that move, or even takes is not a bad move. Gives you a small advantage. What was I asking? Oh, you're asking about this. Is this like an Elyakhin? Sure it is, yeah, because you're luring the pawns forward. You're probably going to put your knight on g6 just like you put it on b6 in the Elyakhin's. The Elyakhin's for everybody. We have some players that don't know all these openings. The Elyakhin's goes like this, attacking the pawn advances, the knight goes here. And then, for example, the knight might go back here next, for example, if White attacks it. And Black's idea is to have pretty good development and then at the same time try to break up this center. So the question is this similar? And yeah, of course, it's very much similar. So a good question and a good observation, because White could go crazy. Now, if White starts attacking this immediately, I don't think it's, well, actually, it is pretty reasonable. I think there's some problems with this move. Some crazy moves like this can be an issue, because after that you have queen h4 check, and this guy's hanging. Anyway, so yes, it's a similar line. I think it's worse. I think Elyakhin is better than the position after knight e5, which is almost certainly better for White, whereas Elyakhin's is still quite playable. In fact, someone asked about that last week. Okay, I have a good luck following I.M. Watson if you are blind. Here, here, then go here, here, and here. Yeah, I've had this objection before about my lectures, but these lectures, you are supposed to be watching the board. I can't name every move. That would be really crazy. I don't think I'd even be very good at it. So I'm sorry about that, but I think or it could be just a joke that he's saying if you're blind, you can still hear. But I hope some people have actually complained, well, one person I think has complained that I say here and I don't name the move, but you can just imagine trying to name all the moves. I think that would be a very awkward. So I'm sorry about that, but it just would be way too slow. So I'm sorry about that, if you're serious, and if not, it's a good joke. So, all right, maybe you can say whether that was a joke or not when you give me another comment. What else? What else are we doing here? Okay, there's more questions. Now, are there other ones in the chat box? Okay. In your conventional openings, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Yeah, there's some good comments. So you don't always have to ask a question, you just make a comment. It's nice that there's a little conversation going on and people answer each other as they go along, especially if I'm getting boring. You can go off on your own conversation, which is fine with me. Hopefully I'm not giving you that problem. Let's try another Twitter or email question and then maybe wrap it up. Let's see. I got one. Let me cover some from earlier lines again, earlier weeks, because I'll get too far behind them. So one idea here is asked, what do you think Black's best bet is against the Samish KID? And I think we looked at that. And one of the questions was, what do you think of the pawn sacrifice c5 in the King's Indian? I think I didn't really answer that sufficiently in the Samish variation. Okay, first of all, this is the Samish variation with this move f3. It's not an irregular line, so it doesn't answer the earlier question about irregular lines where I gave 3 irregular variations. This is a very, very much a main line. And what I wanted to say about c5, I don't think I got to this last week, is that this is working for Black still in theory as far as I can make out. Players of White just avoid this line. The idea is that usually you take this first, and then you take here, and it looks like White's just a pawn up threatening this. But it turns out that Black has a tremendous dark square pressure. He can play like this with pressure down here. He can also play the move b6. It's very useful, kicking the bishop and getting the pieces out really quickly. Notice that White can't castle. And I'll just have you check out the theory of that. I can't show you all the lines, but one idea is that you're covering these dark squares. The big weakness in the King's Indian is the d4 square. Even early on, it's kind of a weakness. Well, or at least it's a sore spot. It's the only real weakness in the King's Indian is this square because it can't be supported by adjacent pawns. So you'll find that most lines of the King's Indian, d4 plays a huge role in Black's counterattack. So anyway, after this move, you might say, well, what about this? But then it turns out that just simply attacking the center like a Benoni position is okay. Now, there's nothing wrong with d5. But the most popular thing to do now is simply leave that sitting there. Because if black takes, white's got a Maroczy bind with very nice development. This is almost bound to be slightly better for white. Black can play this way, and does, but more often black plays this move, just trying to keep some pressure up. And he's still perfectly willing to give away that pawn. It's even better now, because the knight's not very well placed. So a knight can come. After you take that pawn, a knight can sometimes swing into this square, for example, play knight b4. So after that move, white still keeps up the tension usually. Or actually, now white will often play that move. There are a couple moves here. White can either keep up the tension, for example, a move like this, or play a move like this, in which case black's knight goes here. And then if you play to attack it again, black gets a lot of nice tactics. White's position's a little bit too loose, although there's some very pretty games. So white tends to do something else here. I won't go any further than that. But the first answer is yes, it's doing quite well. The pawn sacrifice c5. Capturing that pawn is doing quite well for black. And therefore, white plays other moves usually. That's kind of the answer. And that's a good indication that the pawn is accepting the pawn sacrifice is in good shape for black, because otherwise you'd have all these top players doing it. Good question. I think last time I talked about how I played for many years. I've played this move knight c6 in this position, which has similar ideas that the knight's going to go to that nice square if it's attacked. And this, but after that, it's a little more complicated. Black usually tries to play for the move b5 to break up the center. And we are well into this show. Let's see if there's one more chat question. But I think I should probably leave you people in peace for this week. I think that's a pretty good place to wrap it up. And I'm sorry about the usual technical delay at the beginning. We'll try to do better next time. But I want to thank everybody for coming on. Let me remind you about how to send questions, since I'm getting more questions before the show than during the show, which is great because they can be well thought out, and they can be more complicated because I can give a more answer, and I can figure out how to give an answer online that everybody can understand, but is not too much unresearched or too complicated. So the ways to do that is you can do Twitter with hashtag AskIamWatson, AskImWatson, or you can send an email to askIamWatson@chessclub.com. That'll get to me. Or you can message me on ICC at John L. Watson, John L as in lion, Watson. That's my ICC handle. And you can send anything you want there. If it's too long a question, remember you can split it into 2 messages. So please feel free to do that. I'm having a great time. I love it when you send me things. It's great and makes me think about things. I think the questions have been uniformly excellent thus far. And I thank everybody who tuned in here and everybody on the chat channel. And I'll see you next week. Thank you.